So you've been playing for different soundtracks, especially like video games and movies. So I saw especially you played for the soundtrack of a video game, God of War Ragnarok, which is a video game that's based on like the Vikings. So you're like a Viking warrior, you're doing battle. So you have the Scandinavian theme. And then you also played for the soundtrack for Mary and the Witch's Flower, which is a Japanese anime film. So first of all, Scandinavian video game, Japanese anime film. That shows the versatility of the instrument. But what's the process like for playing for a soundtrack in particular?
Let's talk about both of those if we have time. So they were just two totally different projects. So God of War Ragnarok was actually composed by Bear McCreary, who you may know for his work on Rings of Power, Outlander, which I've never seen. Actually, I've never seen any of them. Don't tell him that. Bear, please don't be offended. He would think it's funny. But believe it or not, I've never even played God of War Ragnarok. But, that process was very different because that was actually recorded in my home studio where I'm sitting right now. And that process was kind of a quasi sort of tryout at the beginning to where they sent me this long session. And sometimes it was like, play this literally on the page. And then other times it had a word where it would say, play something spooky or spidery sounding phrases. And other times it would say, play in sync with, the nickel harpa. And so it was just like kind of testing the sense I had. This was never directly communicated, but the sense that I had was it was sort of testing what are his strengths. Does he need something written or is he better improvising over a theme? And I think that as it progressed, a lot of times what I would get would basically be a sheet of music with some background tracks that I had to record over. And Sam Ewing, who I actually worked with as kind of my communicator, he was also a very skilled composer on the project as well. And it pretty much got to the point where Sam would just send me something and say, Josh, we trust you, do your thing. We're just sending you notes, but you interpret what those notes mean and add the charm, the character, all those things that our digital libraries and samples and virtual instruments, all those things that can't do, humanize this in a way. So a lot of that was just me guessing and keeping in mind this whole time I had no idea what the soundtrack was because there was a non-disclosure agreement. They could not tell me, even though they wanted to. So I guessed it was God of War Ragnarok. I guessed and I was right, but I didn't know. So I was really just having to listen and trust my instincts about what to do. And the in-game music from people that I know, there's a lot of hammer dulcimer in the in-game music. And a lot of that depends on what action you take may trigger, the sound of the dulcimer. The actual soundtrack that was condensed to 2 hours, I don't know how long the official soundtrack, like the in-game is. I'm guessing it's probably 8 or 12 hours long. That's a guess. But they had to condense all that to 2 hours. And there's not as much of the dulcimer on the actual sound track that was released. But it was a huge honor, and it actually ended up winning a BAFTA award and was nominated for a Grammy. And I was I think I was one of 9 instrumentalists that were credited on that. So my name's actually in the in-game credit. And it's the first project I've ever been credited that was Grammy nominated and BAFTA winning. So it was a huge honor.
No, absolutely. And I'm like, I do not play God of War either, but I oftentimes will listen to video game soundtracks while I'm writing. I legitimately love the God of War soundtracks. It's absolutely fantastic. And I think it's so cool that they're using the hammer dulcimer in the gameplay when you do specific actions. Because, anyone who's played, video game in any sort of context knows that's some of the most important stuff, setting the mood when the gamer's taking action. So that is so cool. Now let's switch gears to the movie then.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell me about the process for Mary and the Witch's Flower.
So do you know of Studio Ghibli?
Yes.
Yes. So Mary and the Witch's Flower, there was a time when Miyazaki said, I'm done. I'm done with Studio Ghibli. And he closed it. And he actually closed it twice. And the second time that he closed it, he said, this is it. This is my understanding. If there's anything was lost in translation, then feel free to correct me. Seriously. But, the artists, everybody but Miyazaki said, I'm not done. I'm not done. You can be done, but we're not done. And we want to keep this legacy going. So they restructured the same, I think it was 400 or 500 artists, and restructured it as Studio Ponok. So, and literally their motto was to continue the heritage, the legacy of Studio Ghibli. And it was kind of interesting. They actually flew me to Tokyo for this soundtrack, and I would get 2 business cards from people that I would meet. One would say Studio Ghibli, and the other one would say Studio Ponok. And so for all intents and purposes, I really do think of this as a Studio Ghibli film, even though it's branded as Studio Ponok. And Studio Ponok today, now that Ghibli decided to reopen again, I don't know how they see themselves. I know that they're still making awesome films, and it's still in the Ghibli style. So it's kind of an interesting relationship right there. But this was the first film, Mary and the Witch's Flower, that the Studio Ponok brand made. And actually, the director of When Marnie Was There directed it. He also did The Secret World of Arrietty, which was, I believe at the time, one of the best selling box office successes for any of the Studio Ghibli films. His name was Hiromasa Yonebayashi. And he also won an Academy Award for his work on When Marnie Was There. One of 2 Japanese animation studio Ghibli artists or directors, sorry, one of 2 to actually be nominated for an Academy Award, the other one being Miyazaki. So it was just like this huge honor. I was just like, wow, I can't believe this is actually happening. So they actually flew me to Tokyo to record. And it was very different because I did have the sheet music. I didn't know what it was. I was able to actually see the film while I was recording. And I had the composer there, Takatsugu Muramatsu, who did the soundtrack for the Ghibli film When Marnie Was There as well. And he actually composed every note that I played. So there was very little freedom as far as, hey, Josh, here's a lead sheet, do your own thing. No, it wasn't that at all. But it was very unique in that I had to learn to play with the Japanese accent and then also communicate through translators. And it was a lot. And they knew that. And they were very, 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 very kind to me, very respectful to me, and actually went out of their way to show their appreciation multiple times. One of those was they flew me to Hollywood for the American release, actually, and they had me play a special set before the showing of the film, and then actually took me out to dinner with the producer and the director of the film afterwards. And I got to play at the Chinese theater there in Hollywood, which was a lot of fun. So yeah, it was a huge honor, but 2 very different approaches. And part of that reflects the difference between an American, composer, somewhat, not exclusively, but somewhat an American composer and a Japanese composer. The approaches, and I'm speaking broadly, I really am, because every person is very different, but broadly speaking, the Americans love improvisation. In a Japanese culture, at least historically, their music is honoring, the intent of the composer, that the best way to do it is to play it as the composer intended. And we do that in America too. But I've just noticed, being an American in my international settings, I'll look at a sheet of music and I'll be like, yeah, I want to do it this way. And some cultures would say, what? How? Why would you do that? That's disrespectful. I'm like, no, it's not. This is just my interpretation of it. So, I got to do that on God of War. I didn't get to do that on Mary and the Witch's Flower.
Yeah.